Welcome back to the Hands-On Outdoor Podcast. I'm your host, Cordy Barnes. Today we are sitting inside because it is raining, and it has been raining since about 6 o'clock last night. We had some pretty nasty storms roll through, and I was told there was actually 4 tornado warnings that happened up and down the Delmarva Peninsula. I myself saw 3 of those warnings. Fortunately, I don't think any of them touched down. I'm sure there was some damage somewhere from the storm. If you're here on Delmarva, I'm sure you've noticed it too. We went from, a fairly dry stretch to where everybody was talking about needing rain to getting a whole lot of it in a very short amount of time. And that brings me to what I want to talk to you guys about today. Today, the topic of our podcast, topic of episode 2, is from drought to downpour. And basically, after last night's rain and today's rain, some places have seen like a lot of standing water. There's been some localized flooding, your ditches, your fields, it's got some standing water in it. It got me thinking about something that I don't think a lot of people really consider, and that is what actually happens when we go from drought conditions to heavy rainfall. Most people look at the rain as either good or bad, and good rain's great because we need it for our crops, we need it for our flowers, we need it for our gardens. Rain makes things pretty. But at the same time, rain can be bad if we get too much of it, or if we just simply have plans. The rain can ruin our plans. If you wanted to go out fishing today, or if you were having a wedding on the beach with the way it's been raining today, I'm pretty sure you know all about ruined plans. And part of what I wanted to talk to you guys about is there's a lot more happening below the surface than just ruined plans and pretty flowers. The drought to downpour is affecting the fish, the wildlife. It's affecting our water quality. It's obviously affecting plant growth in our gardens and all of our natural species. And in some cases, it's actually changing entire ecosystems, at least temporarily. So today I thought we'd talk about what happens when that drought ends and the heavy rains finally show up. So to get started, let's talk about the drought itself. And when we go through long periods of no rainfall, obviously our natural water levels begin to drop, our ponds start to shrink up, our creeks slow down, wetlands can dry up, and even small pools that you might see, like in the woods that have been logged where the tractor tires were in there, from the skidder making ruts. Those will hold water, and wildlife rely on those temporary pools. And what happens is when it gets dry, those just completely disappear. So the frogs have nowhere to lay their tadpoles. The local wildlife won't have little areas to drink, which means they have to move further, to get something to drink. It affects everything. And I think a lot of people see the water levels changing, but they don't realize what's happening, And one thing that I don't think that think, man, that was a mouthful. One thing that some people don't think about is that fish don't actually breathe water. And what they're actually doing is they're extracting oxygen that's been dissolved into the water using their gills. So their gills are kind of like lungs on the outside. And what happens is as the water goes by, the dissolved oxygen that's inside the water attaches itself to their gills, and then it's absorbed. And during those drought periods, your water levels get low, the oxygen levels get low, and the water temperature is constantly rising. So it can really stress fish out or stress any type of aquatic species way before the pond even starts to show signs of drying up, because the water levels or the water temperatures will get warm and the oxygen level will start to dissolve almost immediately. So that's one reason, like, you'll find fish, like, often they'll be concentrated in areas around moving water or a creek mouth, places where there might be springs or dams and spillways and stuff like that, because the water is still moving, which causes aeration, and those areas will usually contain higher levels of dissolved oxygen so that the fish and other aquatic life can get in there and actually still breathe. But sometimes these drought conditions can make fishing easier because of those concentrated areas. But easier fishing doesn't always mean healthier fish either. These fish that are congregated like that are often under far more stress than they would be in any normal conditions at all. And droughts can really take a toll on fish populations. And fish aren't the only thing that this affects. It also affects, all of our wildlife. It affects deer. They become more dependent on reliable water sources, meaning they'll have to travel further, which means they're crossing more roads, which puts you and me in danger, as well as the deer. In the springtime, when they're dropping their fawns and there's no rain, we're in a drought. Now these fawns have to try navigating roads for the first time just to go get something to drink. Birds, they'll congregate around the ponds and the wetlands, and they'll still be able to get to areas that contain water. So birds might have it the easiest. You have insects and amphibians. They all begin changing their behavior, all based on available moisture. These ponds that dry up, the frogs have to move. And if there's no moisture from one place to another, the frogs become really stressed and can dry out before ever making it to another water source, and ultimately ending in their demise. So water is something that is extremely important to everything, every ecosystem, and every creature inside of those ecosystems. All of our wildlife depends on that moisture. And what happens after all of the drought and everything drying up, and then the rain arrives, right? We get this just giant amounts of rain, and everything's going to be great, right? Everything's going to go back to normal. Simple solution, right? But nature isn't that simple. And I think one thing that would surprise a lot of people is extremely dry ground doesn't always absorb water very well. So you would think that dry soil would soak up every drop of rain like a sponge. And after long periods without rain, the soil can actually become so compact, so hard, that in some cases the top layer will actually become somewhat water resistant. And when those heavy rainfalls, and when they come down quickly, the water often can't penetrate the ground fast enough. Like it hits the ground, and instead of being absorbed, it just runs, and that water moves across fields, across roads, lawns, creating terrace, and, it picks up all types of sediment. It picks up leaves. It'll pick up nutrients. It'll pick up fertilizers up out of the field, all kinds of debris. And then it takes all of that, all of those debris, all of those nutrients, everything, and it takes it straight to our creeks, straight to our rivers, our ponds, our bays. Then our water turns muddy after these major rain events, and all that material, all of it is being pulled and transported downstream. And in many ways, the flooding after a drought isn't just about the amount of rain. It doesn't have to rain a lot. We don't have to get 5 inches of rain. You can get an inch of rain that falls quickly. It's not about the amount. It's about how quickly the ground can actually absorb that rain. And after these long dry spells, that absorption rate is often much lower than most people expect. That's where you get your flash floods. That's where, you get roads that wash out, all those sorts of things. When we get these drought-like conditions and heavy rainfall, it can really ruin a lot of infrastructure and take out all kinds of different things. Back about 20 years ago, we got 13 inches of rain here after a drought. And I can't tell you how many roads washed out, how many people's homes flooded. I mean, we had entire cities under feet of water for days. And it was all because we had a drought ahead of time. Now, 13 inches of rain is nothing I mean, that's a lot of rain. I mean, a lot of rain. So when you mix those two together, you get really bad conditions. Now, because of all of that, let's talk about the fish, because fishing is where a lot of us notice these changes first. We notice the runoff, we notice the water quality, the visibility or water clarity. The water becomes super stained, muddy. Some people might even consider it gross, and a lot of people just automatically assume that's a bad thing. And sometimes it is. And, like I said, for flooding, it can be a bad thing. But it also depends, like, what you're doing, how much rainfall we're getting. But if you're a fisherman, if you're an angler, and it just rained really hard, and you're thinking to yourself, I'm not going to bother going fishing because the water clarity is awful, and I'm not going to catch anything. You have to remember that a lot of fish have what's called a lateral line, and it runs down each side of their body. The lateral line is a sensory organ that actually allows fish to detect movement and vibrations in the water around them. And it's kind of like their way of feeling their surroundings. And they can actually detect movement nearby even when they can't see very well. So if you've ever watched a school of fish suddenly turn at the same moment, or seen a fish avoid a predator before they could ever even possibly see it, that's the lateral line at work. When you walk up on a bank and you can see fish, but as soon as you walk up, they all scatter. That is them feeling the vibrations of you walking on the ground through their lateral line. It's constantly sensing pressure. It's pressure changes. It's constantly sensing movement around them in the water. And if they're close enough to the shore, they can feel those as well. And that's actually one reason why species like catfish will continue feeding heavily after these heavy rains, because they're not relying entirely on vision. They're using the vibrations. They're using scent that's in the water. They're using those lateral lines to locate water. Or locate food, locate water. Meanwhile, bait fish are being pushed around by changing currents and by different debris. The food sources are getting washed downstream. Insects are falling into the water, and worms, other organisms are getting displaced. And these catfish or other predatory species that use these lateral lines will sit downstream and wait for all of these things to come by and just snatch them up. So if you can find, certain areas where the water is being congregated in certain ways, and you have the right baits and stuff like that, sometimes these heavy rainfalls can actually produce more fish for an angler than they would during these dry and drought conditions. Suddenly that creek that wasn't producing a fish a week ago may become a feeding frenzy simply because the conditions changed. And that rain doesn't just affect the fish either. Think about the frogs, like we talked about. Think about insects. Think about the birds. Many species have actually evolved around rainfall cycles. So frogs often become far more active after heavy rains because the moisture allows them to move safely without drying out. Certain insects only appear after rainfall. And birds and frogs, they take advantage of those insects. Predators take advantage of all the increased activity. And it's all connected. It's all one big circle. One small weather event can trigger an entire chain reaction throughout the entire ecosystems. And, we all know that nature is constantly adapting. And honestly, that's one of the reasons that I love spending time outdoors probably the most. Nothing ever stays the same. Ponds are constantly changing, creeks are constantly changing. Animals are adapting, plants are adapting, everything's adapting. And it's time we adapt too. And if you're paying attention, there is always something new to learn. There's an entire chain reaction happening that most people never notice. And I think that's one of the reasons I enjoy it as much as I do, because the more time you spend outside paying attention to the small details, the more you realize that nothing happens in isolation. A drought affects the water affects the fish can affect the birds, the rain changes the landscape, everything responds. Most people see rain as something that helps their garden, ruins their plans for the weekend, but when you start looking a little closer, you start realizing that it's part of something much bigger. There's a much larger story. And honestly, I think that kind of sums up what hands-on outdoors is all about. Not just getting outside, but understanding what you're seeing once you're there. So here's this week's challenge. Next time it rains, don't wait for it to stop. Go outside. If it's thundering and lightning, don't go outside. Wait till it's done. Go outside afterwards. Look at the ditches. Look at the ponds. Look at the creeks. And pay attention to what changed. You might be surprised how much happened while you were sitting inside. Now, I would like to thank you all for hanging out with me today. I appreciate you spending part of your day with me. And until next time, get outside, learn something new, and just pay attention to the world around you. I'll see you on the next episode of Hands On Outdoors Podcast. I'm Cordy Barnes. Get outside.
Dirt roads, fence roads, cold creeks where the wind blows. Sunrise, blue skies, every bend's a new surprise. Tall grass, worn path.